Welcome to the Down South Hunting Podcast, presented by the Onyx Hunt app. This is Mike Higman. You know, it is really easy to get in the habit of just saying who the guest is and the topic at the very beginning of the episode, and then do a little intro, and then you get into the interview, and you do the intro all over again. So I'm going to spare that for y'all. But I will tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about. If you are a deer nerd like me, you're going to really love this episode. We are talking about stuff like the effect of rainfall on deer antler growth. We're going to be talking about the difference between movers and sedentary bucks when you're hunting mature deer. We're going to get into some CWD stuff, and if we're all going to get killed by zombie deer in a few years, coyote predation, and a bunch of other cool stuff that has to do with deer hunting. So stay tuned for that. I do want to cover a few quick things. The interview is kind of long, so I'm going to get through this pretty quick. One, you need to use the Onyx Hunt app if you're not using it yet. You can get a free trial. Check it out at onyxmaps.com. Next is check out Nomad Hunting Gear if you haven't checked into it. We did an episode last year with Jason, the owner. Really cool guy, and kind of got the backstory of that. So be checking that out. You should be on huntinggeardeals.com. Let me tell you something that real quick. If you are in the market for a cooler this summer, it seems like all the cooler manufacturers are rolling out all kinds of discounts, and I'm sure that's going to continue into Memorial Day. So don't pay full price for whatever fancy cooler you want to get, whether that's a Yeti or an Arctic or whatever, Orca. There's like 10 different manufacturers now. So make sure you're getting a good deal on that by being on the Hunting Gear Deals email list. And there's one other thing I wanted to tell you. Last week, I asked for some possible guests, give me some ideas, that kind of thing. And y'all really came through. I really appreciate it. I can't tell you the number of people I got, but everybody gave me great ideas. They're not all going to pan out, but it really helped fill up my list, potential people, and a lot of them I'd never heard of. So keep those coming if you think of people. And, I don't have to ask. Just if you think of somebody, just shoot me an email or send me a message on social media, whatever. So I appreciate y'all listening. We're getting, I don't know who we is at this point. I'm getting tons of support from y'all, and I really appreciate it. So, okay, I'm ready to go. Let's do this interview. All right, I'm really excited to have Lindsay Thomas Jr. back on the show again with us today. He is the QDMA's Director of Communications and the editor of their magazine, Quality Whitetails, and he has been on with us. This is the third time we've done this Southeast Deer Study Group episode, and he's also been on with us when we did the deer movement study. So I think he's got most frequent guest title so far. So welcome back, Lindsay.
Thank you, Mike. This is the third time we've done the Deer Study Group?
It is.
Podcast?
You were episode number 2, and then again in episode number 37. So this is something I really look forward to. I love geeking out on the science stuff with deer. And if you enjoy this episode and you're new to the podcast, go back and check out 2 and 37 with Lindsay, because basically it's the same thing with different studies. So, and it might be fun to listen to episode number 2 and see how we've changed since then, hopefully for the better.
Well, I look forward to this too, because, well, I'm like you. I mean, one of the reasons I enjoy the work I do for QDMA and writing this annual article and going to the Deer Study Group meeting and reporting on all this stuff is because I geek out over all this deer science too. So
yeah, it's just fun
I look forward to
this
conversation.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So for those that haven't listened to the prior episodes, can you give us a kind of a quick summary of what the Southeast Deer Study Group is?
Yeah, every year, state wildlife agencies get together in sort of regional conferences to talk to each other, share information on their deer research, the work they're doing, ideas, etc. And really the biggest of these conferences, there's one in the Midwest, one in the Northeast, but the biggest is the Southeast Deer Study Group, and it's the oldest, I think been around 42 years now. And it's basically, it rotates around 15 states in the Southeast, and each state's wildlife agency hosts it in a different year. This past year, it was in Kentucky, or not this past year, this past February, it was in Kentucky. And it's not just state wildlife agencies, it is also researchers and students from universities that have deer-focused or wildlife-focused programs as well. So you got state and federal folks. It's basically deer scientists and managers, professional managers coming from all over. And even though it's the Southeast Deer Study Group meeting, this meeting, because it's the biggest and oldest, attracts folks from all over. There are researchers there, even presenters and speakers who are there from outside the Southeast, from the Midwest and Northeast as well. So it's a big, 2-day blitz of deer science, but among folks who are deer hunters and just love deer like you and I do. They're scientists, but, the vast majority of them, where are they in November during the rut? They're up a tree just like you and I are. So they love this stuff, and it's just fun to connect with them and see all this go on.
Yeah, it's cool because a lot of them, you get the hunting side of things as well. It's not just straight science, which we can, try to figure things out from. But the people that are doing the studies are also thinking like, oh, how can I apply this next fall?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we are there, is to bring home the information for our members and other deer hunters from this meeting, translate it into a language that deer hunters can use to make their hunting better, to understand deer better, and even to improve deer habitat and to do things smarter and wiser and cheaper. So, there's always a lot of useful information. These folks, like you and I've talked about before, these folks talk to each other in the language of science at this meeting, and often some of the terminology is over my head. I've sort of learned to interpret over the years, but that's kind of my job, is come home from this meeting and take what I gathered and translate this for deer hunters like me and say, okay, here's what this means to you from a practical sense as a deer hunter, as a habitat manager.
Okay, so I got to ask, it's in Kentucky. Is Kentucky Southeast? Where's the line for Southeast? I guess they're one of the 15 states then.
Yeah, West Virginia and Virginia are included in that group, so it rotates around those states and goes all the way out to Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas are included.
You and I were both in Louisville for ATA this, I guess, winter. Yeah. And I got to tell you, I did not feel like I was in the Southeast when we were up there.
Well, all I know is, given Kentucky's penchant for producing good bourbon, I'm glad that it's in this meeting rotation. So
I kind of feel like Kentucky is like, and hopefully we have some listeners from Kentucky that can straighten me out on this if necessary. But I feel like maybe Kentucky is like half and half. I don't know where the line in Kentucky is, but I know there's some Southerners in Kentucky, but I also know some of it feels a lot like the Midwest.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely sort of the borderline there, borderlands. But
and I am jealous of their deer.
Count them in. Yeah. And this, by the way, was I've been with QDMA almost 16 years now, and this was the first. I'm trying to remember. I think it would have been 2004 was my first Southeast Deer Study Group meeting. It was in Kentucky, and I have now come full circle. So to come back to Kentucky means I have been to a Southeast Deer Study Group meeting in all 15 states that host. So I've started over.
That's pretty neat. And I bet you guys, when you're up there, have some good times going out for dinner and that kind of stuff, just catching up with everybody.
Yeah, there's a ton of interesting folks that I don't get to see except once a year, who are extremely knowledgeable, whether that is, private wildlife consultants, to state wildlife agency biologists, federal agency biologists, and then just a ton of students, the future guys and girls who are going to be managing deer for all of us. They are there, and meeting them and getting to know them and seeing what they're studying and what they're curious about is just super interesting. I can just tell you, 2 days is never enough for me. And it's always really a scramble just to get everybody's contact information so that you can, communicate more with them later. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a blast.
Okay, so I've got this article that's going to be coming out in the next Quality Whitetails issue. And what I wanted to do is just kind of go item through item through these things. And then I know there's some other things that we might be able to hit on when we get done with that. So let's start with Mark Turner of Auburn did a study about late bursts being associated with late ruts and how there's lower productivity in those does.
Yep. So, as many Southern hunters know, that in some areas of the South, we've got weird rut timing, and some of it goes very late. I mean, literally situations where you can cross from one state into the next, just cross the state line and go from an area where the peak of the rut is in November to an area where it's in December or January. And it just doesn't seem to, scientists are still trying to figure this out. Does it have to do with restocking? How do you explain these, the weird rut timing? And you and I have talked about this before. But what Mark Turner at Auburn did was, asked the question of, okay, so you're getting these late ruts in some areas, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. You're getting ruts into January and even early February in some areas. Well, the result of that is going to be fawns born much later than they are in most of the rest of the country. In some of these states, these folks are hunting in the fall, seeing spotted fawns walking around. So Mark asked the question, these fawns are being born late. They're born after really the peak of natural nutrition peak in native forages. Many of them are born in the heat of summer. Is that a challenge, and how does that affect those fawns down the line? And so he looked at yearling does in many of these populations and looked at their productivity, basically pregnancy and productivity rates among yearling does, 1.5 years old. And what he found was that for every month-long delay in the average birth date of that fawn in those areas, he was looking at a 16% decrease in pregnancy and productivity rates. So yearling does born on time or born in a normal timing, were, say, the standard, and any doe that was born a month after that or 2 months after that, suffered in her productivity and pregnancy rates. And I mean, basically what you're saying there is these fawns were born late. They did suffer some kind of nutritional deficiency compared to other fawns or fawns in other areas. And so they were playing catch up. These fawns had to basically mature further than a normal deer would have before they could be as productive as a doe of the same age in an area where the rut was earlier. So basically what he found was, there's a cost to that. And productivity rates were lower. But the good news was that what he saw was that by age 2.5, these same does had overcome that disadvantage and were conceiving normal numbers of fawns compared to populations with a normal rut timing. So basically these fawns, doe fawns is what he was looking at, but you could assume it's probably some similar effect among buck fawns too in terms of antler growth and body size. But these doe fawns had a setback, had to play catch up for a while. At age 1.5, were not as productive as their peers in other areas, but by 2.5 had caught up nutritionally and physically and were just as productive later on in life and throughout the rest of their life as a doe born anywhere else.
Right, that's where my head kind of was going too, is with the bucks. If the does are behind, that would mean the bucks are behind too, and what that meant for antler production. And I guess we'll come back to this, but another study talked quite a bit about. Actually, let's just go ahead and jump ahead, just because I think it makes sense. I want to jump ahead to that other study that discussed rainfall in the first year of a buck's life. By the time he's 5.5, the rainfall in the first year of his life had a big impact on antler size.
Yep. This was in Texas. Massa Onishi, who is a graduate student at Texas A&M Kingsville, that's the Caesar Clayburgh Wildlife Research Institute. He's been doing a lot of work out there and this was actually part of a bigger culling study that I wrote about a few issues back in Quality Whitetails, that basically has found, as other studies have found, is that culling whitetail bucks does not work. So we won't dive into that. That's a different topic. But he had so much data that he was teasing out other ways to look at this. He was looking at environment and nutrition and everything, age, everything that led to antler growth or fed into that and affected it in the lives of bucks. And he had tons of data. So he looked at age, antler scores, and environmental effects for 2,937 individual bucks that were part of this big study. And the way they're doing this out there, they're, capturing these bucks by helicopter. using research permits. Many of them they're capturing as either fawns or yearlings when they can identify that buck with his age at 100% accuracy by looking at the teeth. Then they're recapturing them later. So they've tagged them. They know, if they caught him as a fawn or yearling, then they know exactly how old that buck is if they catch him, say, 6 years later. Mm-hmm. And they're measuring antlers throughout this process, measuring, environmental effects throughout each of the years, taking DNA, looking at who's related to who, looking at who produced the best fawns from an antler standpoint, and all kinds of things that they're getting out of this study. But this was something else they looked at, was local rainfall in the year that each of these bucks was born. Now, you got to remember, we're talking about Southwest Texas. This is an area where, unlike where I live in Georgia or you're in Florida or many of the other Southeast and Northeast and Midwestern states, compared to everywhere else in Texas, rainfall is a much more significant factor. It's semi-arid. You're looking at areas that really are almost desert or, semi-desert. And so rainfall often makes a huge difference in the amount of forage, the quality of forage that's available to a deer in a given year or at any point in the year. So it's a bigger factor there, but it still has a take-home point for us in other areas. But basically, yeah, what you were getting at here is what Massa found when you sum it all up is that the average 5.5-year-old South Texas buck carries a 1/2 inch to 0.8 inches of extra antler per inch of rainfall that fell in its first year of life. So not just fell that year, but in its first year of life. And we're talking about a mature buck, 5.5 years old. You go all the way back 5 years before to when it was born, and you look at the amount of rainfall that year, that was critical to that buck's antler size. If you had a lot of rain, he's probably, as a 5.5-year-old, going to have somewhat larger antlers. If it was a tough year, a drier year, he's probably going to have somewhat smaller antlers. So, just another one of these factors that plays into antler growth. It's not just age. It's not just genetics. Nutrition is a huge part of that. And, the lesson for the rest of us on this, we can't control rainfall, and the Texans can't control rainfall either. And though it's less critical here for us in Georgia or Florida or Pennsylvania, where rainfall levels are more consistent, the lesson is still the same, and that is nutrition is important. You just cannot underestimate the importance of habitat quality and natural forage and high quality natural forage and abundant natural forage to all aspects of health in deer, and that includes antler size. So, yeah, just driving home the point. Rainfall is important in Texas, but the bigger picture is nutrition and natural forage is critical to deer health everywhere.
Yeah, I hear a lot of Western hunters talk about, the rainfall or snowfall, actually, a lot of times for them, these are like, guys that are focusing specifically on like trophy class, big elk or mule deer, want to break records, that kind of stuff. They really focus on how much snow they got the prior year because of how important moisture is for the nutrition up in the mountains. But it's just so crazy to me that this is 5.5 years later after that rainfall has such a significant effect. And there's so many deer involved. It seems like a good, what's the statistical word I'm looking for?
Statistically significant or a large enough sample size. Yeah.
Speaking of that, 2,900 deer is a huge study. Is this something like you think over the next 5 years, more and more data is going to be coming out where they're able to figure things out based on the study? Is this like an unusually large study?
Oh, yeah. And it's been going on 4 years. It will continue for years. It has involved multiple grad students because, it's gone on so long. And Texas A&M Kingsville has a number of this type of work. They've done work like this at the King Ranch. This particular study was at the Comanche Ranch. And they've got so many of these large studies going that literally it will involve multiple graduate students who arrive, study, and graduate and move on into life, after the study began and even before it ends. So you've got all these grad students cycling through, working on all these studies and so many different layers and years of data. It just continues to accumulate, and it's so you can pull out some really, really cool stuff out of that. And it does. You're right. It ties back well to Mark Turner's Auburn study about the does. What you're showing there is that the early years for a fawn are important. That, yeah, ultimately year-to-year cycles are still important for any deer throughout its life. But what happens in those first year or two, is critical. And that's true for people. It's true for deer. You get off to a great start. You can make advancements at earlier ages. But if you are playing catch up as a fawn, that has potential, as Massa found here. It has potential implications throughout the life of that animal, no matter how much great nutrition it gets later on.
It just sounds to me like if you're living in one of those areas with a real late rut, maybe your deer are half a year behind, a similar area, in latitude where, the rut's at a regular time. So
it's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. Now, we know Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, some of these areas are just, great areas for whitetails.
Yeah.
So it doesn't look like, hey, this is sort of the gar hole of the U.S. because of the late rut. That's not the way it works. But the lesson here is, that's true. Many of these fawns that are born late in these areas probably are facing a setback and disadvantages compared to others. But it really, for a deer hunter and deer manager, puts the emphasis on the importance of you managing that herd right and keeping it in balance with the habitat and providing quality forage year-round, whether that's natural forage or food plots, because of the importance of helping these fawns catch up. If you're in a situation where the deer population is out of whack, it's out of balance with the habitat, they don't have high-quality nutrition as they should, the density is too high, and each deer is not getting adequate nutrition, then you're exacerbating that disadvantage of being born late. You're making it worse. But the reverse would be helping fix that.
That also kind of brings into my mind that if you're doing things to improve habitat and that kind of stuff, you're not going to see the full dividends of that until those deer reach full maturity at 4.5, 5.5 years old, because those deer didn't see the benefit when they were fawns.
That's correct. Yep.
All right, so let's jump into CWD a little bit here. Tennessee, I guess they came up with a rating system for the risk level, and it sounds like they were a little bit too late because they came with a risk system right after they found out it had crossed state lines. You get into that a little bit?
No, what happened, Mike, was that they started a risk assessment last year, where what they did was looked around the state. This was, of course, TWRA, the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. They looked around the state and they said, what are the factors that increase the risk of chronic wasting disease having been brought into the state to a certain area? And let's see if we can sort of pinpoint the areas of highest risk. So they looked at, basically predictive risk, things like counties that were close to or on the border with another state that had CWD already, or close to another state that had high numbers of captive deer breeding facilities or captive deer industry facilities, locations within their own state of captive deer facilities. Now, Tennessee does not have a whole lot of captive deer breeding facility or captive deer operations. It's not a big state for that, but there are a few, so they looked at those as well. They looked at the disposal practices of taxidermists and processors who in the past had received whole deer carcasses from other states. Now, of course, now that's illegal, but in the past it wasn't. So they looked at, which processors and taxidermists had taken in whole deer from out of Tennessee and how they had disposed of those deer carcasses. All of these things sort of are, what are the weaknesses or risk points for CWD to have entered Tennessee in the past? And they tallied them up by county and sort of had points, a point system. And what they found was they had a number of sort of high-risk counties and a lot of counties that were lower risk. But of all of them, Hardeman County in southwest Tennessee scored the highest number of points, 87 points on their risk scale. And lo and behold, literally, I think it was, I think it was a month or two. when exact, I'm trying to remember the amount of time they said between, months, just a few months after they completed this assessment, boom, they got their first positives in Hardeman County, Tennessee. So, and of course, as we know now, after Tennessee discovered that outbreak in that area, they started doing some more sampling, focusing on that area, and they found, unfortunately, a good many more positives. In other words, this outbreak centered in that area had been there a while before it was discovered, so it had been quietly spreading. So the point was, as James Kelly with TWRA said at the meeting, we wish we had started this risk assessment a long time ago and gotten to work on this sooner. And his point was, to all the other states that don't have CWD yet or haven't discovered it yet, get busy, do this now. Evaluate the risk points, the entry points where CWD would be likely to come into the state, whether that is associated with deer movements related to captive deer facilities, whether it's associated with carcass transportation associated with deer processors and taxidermists that accept deer from out of state, whole carcasses from out of state, things like that, or proximity to borders with other states that have CWD. Get busy now assessing that risk, because it's likely to point you in a way that will help you find CWD sooner if you have it. Because, in the end, right now, states do not have unlimited budgets for testing and sampling and all of that for CWD. So they're having to kind of broadly test. And if they could direct their CWD testing in a more focused way, they may catch it sooner. And of course, that's critical. Catching it soon is critical. Unfortunately, Tennessee did not catch it soon. They caught it after CWD had put down roots in that area and started to spread. So they are now in a, sort of management situation. Just how do we deal with this? They're not in a situation where they might actually be able to eradicate the handful of deer, one or two deer that have it. They're past that point. So, they said they wish they'd done this risk assessment sooner, and they urged other states to get on the ball and do that if they weren't already working on it.
So looking at this map, it's heavily shaded in the southwest. I'm assuming that's right around where the Mississippi line is. Was the adjacent county to Hardeman? Is that where CWD is found in Mississippi?
Yeah, they have found it now in a couple of the counties on the Mississippi state line in Mississippi, bordering that area, but also a couple more counties further down into northern Mississippi. So, what is the story there? We don't know. In other words, we
don't know whose fault it is.
That's right. Yeah. Did it reach Hardeman County, Tennessee first, and then spread into northern Mississippi, or vice versa? We don't know yet, and may never know. But yeah, the red in that map is along, most of it is clustered along the Mississippi state line and the Alabama state line. And that may be related, or is definitely related, to the fact that both Mississippi and Alabama have fairly significant captive deer operations and industries going on. They've allowed that. And so over the years, you're talking about live deer being trucked in and out of those states to those facilities. And that, of course, is a risk factor. It's not the only, but it is one of the big risk factors for transporting CWD around the landscape. So yeah, that certainly, and you'll notice, most of the high-risk counties in that map that you'll see when you read this article are along state borderlines for Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. So they've assessed this risk. What exactly can they do once they found this out? Because I guess Tennessee's already not allowing captive deer there. So let's say, because they're James Kelly from the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency said they wish they had done it 8 to 10 years ago. What could they have done differently had they known?
They could have, had they had this map 8 to 10 years ago, they could have redirected their limited financial and manpower resources for testing and sampling deer to those counties. So basically, without this map, they were just testing and sampling every chance they got statewide. Whether that was, testing roadkill deer that their people came upon, testing sick deer that were reported to the agency, voluntarily maybe gathering some samples from hunter-killed deer or other opportunistic ways that they could get it, but basically just doing it statewide. So casting a net across every county in the state. But if they'd had this map, they could have focused more of those resources, testing and sampling, to these counties that were higher risk. That still does not mean that you'll, necessarily catch it the first place it lands. Just because most of the other counties were low or no risk does not mean CWD is not going to land there. It still could. It just means it's more likely to have landed in these other states with higher risk. And of course, that turned out to be true in this case. But again, yeah, if they'd had this map earlier, they might have caught this sooner. And as I said, as this has been, an important point that hunters have to understand is, if a state can catch a CWD outbreak in the earliest stages, where we're just talking about one or two or, a small handful of deer in a small local area that have this disease, if you can eliminate those deer and come in and reduce deer density in that site, you might actually stop the outbreak from ever taking root. That's apparently what happened in New York around a captive deer facility there that happened, well over 10 years ago. They found CWD in a captive facility. They started monitoring around that captive facility in the months and years after that, and then soon found a couple of wild deer right outside the pen. It had apparently jumped from the wild deer from the captive deer to the wild deer just outside. They continued their monitoring and deer density reduction in that area. And 10 plus years later, they have not found an additional positive case. So that's a success story. But the key was they caught it soon enough. So that's really the goal here. Even in states that have CWD in some counties, it's still the goal in the non-CWD areas to prevent it from reaching those areas. So anywhere where you don't have CWD, the goal is catch it as soon as possible, because you might actually stop it. Once it has put down roots, once it's in the environment, once it is spreading throughout multiple deer and they're kind of getting away from the impact zone and spreading out, it's too late. You're really not ever going to be able to reel that back in. Nobody has done that yet. So catching it soon is the goal. This is why QDMA urges hunters, anytime you see a deer that appears to be sick or behaving strangely, don't just take pictures and post it on social media and go, look at this weird deer. Call your state wildlife agency immediately. Let them know right then. And if they're able to send somebody out, stand there and don't let the deer get away. Stay within sight of it. Don't let it wander off. Help the state agency get their hands on that deer so they can test it. If it turns out to be that it's CWD, and it was one of the earliest deer to have been brought in or to have contracted it somehow in that area, you have possibly helped stop CWD from entering that new area.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's so frustrating about disease is I feel like a lot of hunters just feel helpless, but it seems like at least there's some type of plan of action at this point is to just test as much as resources allow and find it as early as possible and try to stop it at a very localized basis instead of, trying to stop it countywide or multiple counties.
Well, you do have strategies now, once it's established, and some states are having success with it. They've got CWD, but what they're doing is a combined effort between hunters and the agency where they're basically just trying to, reduce deer density in the impact area. Not eradicate deer, but just keep density low. And then they're using targeted culling, where after hunting season is over, if hunters didn't hit the goals for harvest in that area, the state goes in with landowner permission and does some targeted sharpshooting in areas where they know CWD positive deer had been found before. And what Missouri's doing this, Illinois is doing this, some other states are doing this, and they're having success at keeping the prevalence rate low. They're not getting rid of CWD, but they're keeping it from expanding throughout the population. They're keeping sickness rates at, down around in the single digits, 1% to 2% of deer that appear or less that appear to have it in these areas. And if we can maintain that, if you can keep the prevalence rate in an outbreak zone that low, what you're doing is maintaining deer populations for the long haul that can support hunter harvest. Wisconsin quit their sharpshooting years ago because hunters didn't want it done anymore. There was outrage. They stopped it in the early 2000s. And ever since, the CWD prevalence rate in Wisconsin has just continued to climb through the roof. And one day, it's not happening overnight, but one day populations in some of those areas will no longer be healthy enough to support hunter harvest on top of CWD mortality. So, there are techniques once you have this disease for managing it, maintaining it at low prevalence, and so, maintaining a deer population that continue to support hunter harvest. That's what, you do at that point. But yes, the ideal thing is catch it sooner than that and eradicate it before it can land, or prevent it from entering new areas altogether by stopping movements of live deer, by stopping transportation of carcasses from out of state. If you leave your home state and go somewhere else to hunt, find out if you're hunting a CWD area. If you are, get your deer tested there, get them disposed of there, processed there. Don't bring carcasses back to your home state. So yeah, there's a ton that we can all do to help prevent the further spread of this thing.
The thing of going back to Wisconsin, I can see their side of things, because really there's so many unknowns that, they don't want to be the result of an unknown where, nobody knows for sure that culling and that kind of stuff is really going to stop it or slow it down or what. I guess it makes sense that it would slow it down just because there'd be less deer to deer contact. But at the same time, the consequences of not doing anything are huge. So yeah. It's just really not a fun situation to be dealing with.
That is what you just said is exactly right. Many of the techniques that we have for trying to deal with it are unpopular. Nobody likes the idea of the state agency coming in and shooting deer like that, even though it's relatively a small number of deer and it's a surgical strike and it's pretty effective. Still, it's not popular. I don't like that any more than anybody else does, and you wish it didn't have to happen. But you're definitely right. Doing nothing is far worse. If you think the pill is bitter, not taking the pill is a heck of a lot worse. I can just tell you. And that's, so yeah, stopping it from entering new areas is priority one, but managing once it's there to prevent it from simply spreading like wildfire is priority two.
Yeah, I do. I want to have Grant Woods on and talk to him a lot of it, because he is actually dealing with this on his own farm. He makes a living off of, recording, hunting, and habitat management on his own property. And then after the season's over, he's got to turn around and, eliminate deer to keep the populations down. So, and of course he's a wildlife biologist, so he understands the repercussions of what he's doing. And anyway, it's a tough thing to deal with. So I do want to touch on. Well, go ahead.
While we're still on CWD, I'll just throw this out there. And I wrote this in the article that's coming out in the new issue. This was really the first year at Southeast Deer Study Group I can remember where they dedicated almost the entire first day of the 2-day conference to CWD. Mm-hmm. So that really says, how critical this has become. It's now, in multiple states in the Southeast. It really was sad to me that we couldn't spend that time on more interesting stuff about deer biology and hunting and things of use to hunters and things that are fun to learn about. It's sad to me that this has become the dominant issue. But it is. It's unfortunate that this has hit us, in our lifetimes, for you and I that are hunting communicators, and for anyone else who's in the hunting industry or hunting media. Yeah, it's unfortunate that this is during our time. But it's also critical that, we get involved, that we learn about it, that we work to stop it, because it's also an opportunity for us to deal with this now, work on it, and help resolve this situation for future generations and for future deer populations. And I think we will. We will. It's going to take some time and money and research, but we will deal with this. We've dealt with bigger issues in wildlife management in the past, and we'll conquer this one too.
Okay, so I don't mean any disrespect by not knowing his name, but the professor from LSU that said that they had found maybe it wasn't the cure, and like a antivirus for it. Was he at this group?
No.
Can we touch on that a little bit, because it went viral for a little bit where everybody's thinking, oh, they've solved the problem. Can you kind of give us a quick summary of that?
I think February of 2019 is going to go down as one of the crazier months I can remember in the whole story of CWD. I mean, it was like, what is in the water? Because that was when, for whatever reason, the mainstream media suddenly hit on this zombie deer thing.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Went crazy with all these zombie deer headlines, and I was actually quoted for the first time ever in my life in USA Today, and it was to try to convince, USA Today readers that they don't have to worry about deer coming and attacking them and eating their brains. I mean, it's just crazy. But then at the same time, we had this press conference, this publicity stunt up in Pennsylvania about the cure for CWD. And a lot of folks, look, Mike, we all know when anyone is faced with a difficult situation that looks grim and looks tough, and you don't see how you're going to deal with it quickly or easily. When someone comes along who says, hey, I got a cheap, easy solution, we listen.
Yeah.
It's easy. We all tend to think, boy, okay, somebody's got something that'll help me. I'll listen. And that's what's going on here is people are quick and easy to buy into an idea that sounds like happy news. Oh, there's a cure. Oh, we're going to have a vaccine soon. And y'all, we're not. It's like I've tried to say before. If you're sighting in your rifle and you got, 10, 12 bullets all hitting around one area, your group, and one hits way off to the left. Okay, where is your rifle zeroed? It's zeroed in that group, right?
Yep.
That one out to the left was an outlier. You flinched. You squeezed the trigger too hard. You did something wrong, and you had a bullet out to the left. That's the study that found that thinks that bacteria cause CWD or cause the prions. All of the other studies done on this, many, many, many scientific studies over years have pointed to prions as the cause with no connection to any kind of bacteria. That's the group. That's where your rifle is grouping, is around the idea that prions cause CWD. And the bacteria thing is way out over here to the left. It's very unlikely, extremely unlikely, that is factual or that is a trail we need to go down trying to solve the CWD problem. So that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, the biggest thing that when I started looking into the studies, because I was, pretty happy to see it at first. Once I saw that the studies that they used to support it, yes, it was a new news conference, but I want to say the studies were at least 10 years old. It was going back to, they were studying it in elk and that kind of stuff, and realized, okay, this isn't like new science is coming out. Everybody's already looked at this. This would be a lot more public information already if it were legit.
Yeah, it's been around a while. Other scientists have attempted to replicate that study. In other words, try to cause CWD with bacteria. It doesn't work. Meanwhile, many, many studies can easily make a deer sick with prions. It's the prions. So that, period.
Okay. Last thing on CWD, because I want to talk about hunting deer, not CWD, which is not as fun. But there's another topic you guys covered, and that went back to, I know there was a study in France, I believe it was, that showed that macaw monkeys were able to contract the disease, which was very similar to people. So it's like, oh, now they think it can cross barriers. So can you cover what Dr. Brent Race talked about with that?
Yeah, he gave an interesting talk. It was almost over my head scientifically and used tons of big medical terms that, I had to wade through. But, I talked to him after his speech, kind of said, hey, I'm a journalist, not a scientist. Let's talk, and he's with the National Institute of Health's Rocky Mountain Lab in Montana. And they have done extensive efforts to try to make various animals sick with CWD in order to test the species barrier and whether they think that these prions can make humans sick. And he basically explained that these macaque monkeys are about the closest stand-in you can get for humans for disease testing in terms of their genetic similarity to us. And they tried everything they can, injecting the stuff into their brains, feeding it to them, feeding them venison, all these different ways to try to challenge their immune system. And they really don't have any evidence right now that they can make them sick. Everything they keep finding to emphasizes the evidence for a species barrier, that people can't get this. Now, they have, there's been other studies where they've taken humanized mice that have been sort of genetically engineered to be more similar to people, and they can make them have some issues. There are other, a species of monkeys that they've been able to make sick, as he reported. As he told me, though, some of these other species, you can look at them wrong and make them with CWD, whereas the macaque really is sort of the standard. And, so their confidence is growing that there's a species barrier, but they still, and this is what he said, still urge caution. And the way I take this, it's complex science and health issues here, but it may be related to, you can even have a situation where some people genetically might be more susceptible to a disease like this than other people. Or there could possibly be variations in the prion itself, that, one particular variation could cause health trouble in people, but not another. Again, this is theoretically. So that's why the concern here, and that's why they don't feel like they can come out and say 100% this will never affect people. So the testing goes on, and the advice is still that if you hunt in a CWD zone, get every deer tested that you harvest, and do not eat the venison until you get your test results back. Wait. And when the test results come back that CWD wasn't detected, then you can eat the venison. And if the test results come back positive, you need to discard that venison safely in a landfill or in a way that the state agency provides for you to make sure it's not out there on the land and potentially infecting other deer. So again, there's no proof that eating that infected venison is going to make you sick. And in fact, what Brent talked about was some of these areas in the country where CWD has been out there for decades, Wyoming, Colorado, some of these other areas in the West, where it's been out there in mule deer and elk for decades and in wild animals. And we know almost to a certainty that over the years, somebody somewhere in those areas, some hunter, has inadvertently eaten venison from an animal that had CWD without knowing it. We can almost be guaranteed that has happened because this has been out there for so long, because the education about CWD is more recent, et cetera. No doubt somebody's eating these animals. So the question then becomes, and they're doing this, they are following human health issues in those areas with the goal of tracking any patterns that emerge in these areas where deer or elk have CWD, and among groups of hunters who consume venison, looking for any type of pattern to emerge, and they're not seeing it. And that is what Brent said. He said, we're at a point where we'd start to see human cases in those areas, and we haven't. If there was going to begin to emerge a pattern of hunters becoming sick with related diseases to CWD, in areas where they've been consuming this venison for years, we're not seeing a pattern yet. And as he said, every year that goes by without cases in people in those CWD endemic zones makes him feel better and better. But he said, I can't tell you how long we need to wait. It's the comfort level's growing, but we're still not 100% certain. And what it came down to, somebody asked him at the end of his talk, they said, because Brent is a hunter and he has kids that hunt with him and they all eat venison. His family eats venison. And he was asked, okay, so, at the end of the day, would you eat venison from a deer that tested positive for CWD? And he said, nope. As much as he stood there and said the evidence for a species barrier is growing and that the evidence for sick people in these areas is not there, as much as he said all that, he still said, nope, I would not eat venison from a sick deer. He stands by what the Centers for Disease Control continue to say, and that is what I just said. If you hunt in a CWD zone, get every deer tested. And if it turns out positive, don't eat the venison, discard it safely.
Yeah.
And again, it's not because we know that will make you sick. We don't. We have strong evidence it won't make you sick. But it's simply a matter of basically reducing your risk to zero if you possibly can. If there's risk, it's very, very low because clearly we're not seeing any patterns of human health problems in these areas. But it helps to reduce your risk as much as possible because, the human variants of this disease in people that we know of, the Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease and things like that people do, that are in people. They didn't come from CWD, but they are related diseases in people. They're not good things. It's just like deer. It is always fatal. Mm-hmm. And it is not something you want. So It's about reducing your risk and keeping your risk at zero. And again, if you hunt in a CWD zone, get the deer tested. Don't eat them if they're positive.
I feel like if I were maybe like 55 plus, and maybe by then they'll have a little more ideas. Maybe at that point I'd be willing to risk it, but just having kids and a family, and
Right.
I feel a responsibility to. The other thing is, just from a hunting standpoint, obviously it's going to be horrible if a person were to contract it, but it would be devastating to the hunting industry as well. I mean, a complete game changer if it turns out, eating deer venison can kill you.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. So,
okay, let's not talk about CWD anymore.
All right, good.
It's good to talk about, but it's like taking your medicine. You don't want too much of it.
Well, we've all got to be. I appreciate you talking about it, because hunters have got to be informed on this. There is so much misinformation out there. There's so many people who don't want to hear this, who want to put their fingers in their ears and say, "Oh, I heard this isn't a problem. Go away." Blah 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 blah. And we just can't do that. You can't put your head in the sand and pretend this is not a problem, or pretend that because somebody told you that you don't have to worry about it, it's okay. I'm not trying to scare everybody about it. I don't want people to be scared. But I'm saying become informed, listen and learn and read about it every chance you get, so that you can participate in solving this problem.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about the study that I was most interested and excited about. You just put like a little blurb in there, and I'm hoping you might be even holding back a little bit what all was here. But this is Ashley Jones from Mississippi State and her study of buck movement.
Yep. Yeah, I figured you'd want to talk about that one, and it was definitely an interesting one. So, Ashley, they've got, she was following, I think it was 43 different bucks. They're all wearing a GPS collar on land in east central Mississippi. These are areas that are being hunted, free ranging wild deer, private land, and tracking these bucks for a number of different reasons to learn from them. But one of the things she wanted to look at was risky behaviors. What did these bucks do that put them in the paths of hunters, or elevated their risk of being seen and killed by a hunter? What were the behaviors that, or factors that led to that? And this work is ongoing. That's probably why I didn't share more here in this, was that, even I called Ashley after the meeting to talk with her about this. And, even she finds it a little difficult to sort of sum up what she's found so far in a sound bite that is easy for hunters to learn from and apply, because there were some, there's really no one size fits all approach to understanding how bucks put themselves at risk, or basically put themselves in front of us during the rut. But she ended up categorizing all these bucks into two, quote, personalities. That's sort of the personality is sort of the best term we've been able to come up with, I think hunters have, for understanding bucks with different behavior categories. And the two basic ones she put them into were sedentary, basically a buck that moved less, that didn't have as big of a home range, didn't cover as much ground as others, compared to movers. So you got sedentary and movers, the two buck personalities she looked at. And movers, of course, are bucks that cover more ground, have larger home range sizes. That's the two personalities she looked at. And, of course, she did find that among movers during the peak rut, they had an 81% higher level of risky behavior during the peak rut than the sedentary bucks did. So they were, of the bucks that experienced risk, in other words, that were in front of hunters. This was where it got a little difficult for me to understand. The bucks that were movers were the ones that more likely to be the ones at risk. I mean, and that seems to make sense. But she also found, some other sort of interesting things that again, it makes it not easy to sum up. She found that among these bucks, and all of these were 2.5 and older, all of her 43 bucks were at least 2.5 years old. They're adults. But she found that among the 2.5 and 3-year-old bucks, they took significantly more risk during the peak rut than bucks 4, 5, and 6. Again, that, you're kind of like, well, that makes sense. they're less experienced is what we would kind of guess than these older bucks. Maybe they, have to work harder to try to find breeding opportunities because these older bucks are maybe more dominant, maybe, more experienced at finding does or knowing the areas where the receptive does are going to be. So these younger bucks are having to work harder at it. So they're traveling more and put themselves at more risk. We don't really understand why, but it does seem to make sense. 2.5 and 3-year-olds were, elevating their risk during the peak rut compared to the older deer. However, she found the reverse in the post rut for mature bucks, and that's 5.5 plus. The 5.5 and 6.5-year-old bucks in the study in the post rut were taking more risk than the younger bucks. And, to me, that sort of coincides with feeding behaviors. Post rut, they're worn down. They haven't eaten in a while. They've been busy with breeding and running and chasing does, and it's time to eat and catch up. And so that to me makes sense as well, that these mature bucks are exposing themselves more to hunters in the post rut. So again, it's sort of complicated, and the work is ongoing. I think we'll tease out more insights into this as the data builds and more bucks are added to the study. But Ashley kind of, the way she put it was, look, if you're not seeing the buck you wanted to see, it's not you, it's him. In other words, you may have a buck on camera, but he just doesn't move much. Or it could also be that he moves a lot and he's moving in areas where you're not hunting. So, just because you're not seeing this buck doesn't mean it's because you stink or you are hunting the wrong area or whatever. It could just be his behavior, either as a sedentary buck that doesn't move much or a buck that moves a lot but is moving in another area today. Both of those factors could lead to you not seeing that deer. So yeah, it's not you, it's him, is what she said. So, it's as she wrote in her abstract in the notes here, our results indicate that age, personality, and season had no effect on whether or not bucks experienced risk. Okay, so it's kind of like, wait a minute, hold up, what? Those things had no effect on whether or not bucks experienced risk across the board in a significant manner. However, for bucks that experienced risk, we found personality to be the most statistically supported factor in determining the level of that risk. So there you have it. Of the bucks that were in front of hunters, it tended to be personality that played a bigger role in putting them in front of deer.
Yeah, which goes to say probably the biggest, oldest, bucks are just the ones that were born without a tendency to walk around a lot.
Yeah, that's
lucky.
Possible too. Yeah. So it's we're still not. She still hadn't found the golden key to unlocking.
Yeah.
How to kill that mature buck this fall, but there's still some lessons here. I mean, I killed a 6.5-year-old buck in December in Georgia this past
season.
That's a
great
buck. Thank you. And yeah, I agree. I was floored to have stumbled into that deer. I killed him on December 15th. It was way post-rut in that area, and he was in a food plot stuffing his face with brassicas. So, and clearly he was blind in one eye. His tarsals were stained almost down to his hoofs. He was scarred up. Clearly, this buck was a major rut participant, but we didn't have pictures of him. Nobody had seen him before that, but he put himself at risk because I was in a post-rut food plot, low pressure area, and got lucky. So to me, that kind of says to me, exactly what she found here, that these older bucks, 5.5 plus, put themselves at more risk in the post-rut.
Do you think that's a case where he was living in a different area and moved in because you guys had food?
Could have been. I will say this property that I killed him on is on the Oconee River in middle Georgia, and the river was very high at the time. About half the property was underwater at the time. So it could have been that he was displaced from, some other nearby area, that his home range or core area that right at the time was under the river. But at the same time, we also know that, many bucks wearing GPS collars have been observed to sort of have a rut range almost. Not all, but some have been observed to have a range where they spend summer or some other part of the year. And then shift to a different area of their home range or to a different area altogether to spend the rut. Maybe this was a buck that, had been spending most of the season in the rut somewhere else and had only recently returned to where I hunted to spend the winter. I don't know. There's a lot of explanations for it.
One guy that I think really like this kind of rings true with is watching Midwest Whitetail with Bill Winke. He's always talking about the looking for the right. He's at the beginning of the year. He's looking for which the right deer are, and he knows the personalities of the deer on his property. And a lot of times he won't even hunt specific deer just because he doesn't think he has a good opportunity to kill him. And, maybe he'll get lucky during the rut. So it's kind of interesting that he's looking at, based on trail cameras for the most part and summer scouting, which deer he's going to go after just based on their personality.
Yeah.
I think Mark Drury too talks about daylight walkers, looking for specific deer that are, have a good opportunity to kill.
Absolutely. Look for those deer that are displaying behaviors that give you an opportunity. Walking during the day, walking in areas, hanging out in areas that you know how to hunt effectively. And it goes too for young. If you're watching younger deer, yearlings or 2-year-olds that you're not personally gonna target for harvest, but they have good potential and they're hanging out in areas, spending a lot of time in areas that you can hunt. Those are good deer to watch and protect and sort of encourage, because if they become fully mature bucks at an age that you want to harvest and they're still displaying that behavior of location and daytime movement, et cetera, that's a buck you can capitalize on. Whereas the biggest fully mature buck out there, if he's only, using your particular hunting area during night or, rarely during times that you can hunt him or rarely areas that you can hunt effectively, then, don't spend as much time on him.
And I do think, even with the mature buck, let's say you kind of have an idea of the personality of that buck. If he doesn't move a whole lot, then it sounds like your strategy needs to be get in right where he's at, figure out where he's bedding and get right there. And, if he's a guy that moves around a lot, maybe you're better off hunting transition areas and corridors.
Right.
Well, I've had Ashley's name on my potential guest list for a few months now. I don't even remember where I saw it. Probably on some blurb you guys put out on Twitter, on the QDMA account. But I remember seeing her name and wrote it down because this study sounds really interesting to me.
Yeah. You should give her a call because I think that it is the kind of thing where a good long podcast conversation could really sort of tease out some of the difficult questions out of the data she's got.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you, so I know Mississippi State was kind of working on like a bigger movement study. Is this the main study they're working on, or do they have like several going on right now that you know about?
I think they've got several going on.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the next one deals with Florida. They FWC tests a lot of deer. I don't know if we've talked about this on the show or not, but they put out basically a peak rut map based on the conception dates of fawns. And
have you seen it?
Yes. Yeah, it's actually something I've looked at for years, and it really I hunt a lot of different areas across the state and a lot of different public wildlife management areas. And basically, before I apply for a hunt, I want to know when the rut is. So a lot of times it'll coincide here with when the muzzleloader season is. I'm not sure why they choose to do that, but it seems to match up. So it seems like that's a goal of the Conservation Commission. But the frustrating part is because what we talked about earlier, a lot of times the rut could be different by 2 months just by crossing a highway.
Yes.
So it's difficult to pinpoint these areas because you might have one spot in a county that has a date. Well, you don't know if that could be 2 months off. So what they found is that May is the only month they know, or not know, but they have not been able to show any breeding occurring. And basically every other month of the year, you could have breeding going on in Florida.
That's right. Somewhere in Florida, every month of the year except May, there's some deer doing some breeding. And that's, this Elena Garrison with the FWCC presented this information. We're talking about 580 does that they had, fetal information from. They could backdate the fetus to determine the day it was conceived on. And that's how they put this together, for all 36 counties and across 9 years. It's pretty exhaustive information. And they would not have looked at one data point, one deer, and said, okay, this is where the rut peaks in this county. It takes, and they know this, it takes a lot of data points to begin to see a pattern, just like sighting in your gun, like we talked about earlier. So, this is pretty good information and amazing that, and as I said here, okay, May was the only month of the year when no deer are breeding in Florida. Well, at least being caught at it by the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. There might be some random
wouldn't
doe
surprise
that,
me at all.
but they just didn't find one. Most of them, the peaks scatter everywhere from the Panhandle down to the Everglades, all over the place. And you're right. One of their intentions with this study was not just, gee whiz for hunters, here's when the rut is, but it was to help them set seasons to allow hunters to capitalize on some of those peaks. I mean, if you've got a deer season that doesn't let you hunt the rut locally, where it might be peaking at a different time, that's unfortunate.
I think that's kind of a struggle in South Florida. There are some places where I do think the peak is probably at the end of July and the season's just not open yet. But they're already opening the season. Sometimes maybe it is the very end of July they open it, but
yes, they are. They're starting to open them earlier and earlier.
I hope that means they're going to update the map with more data points that I know this is like a continuing thing. This isn't like, okay, we're done, Yeah. So I hope that I'm going to keep an eye out for it. I will, if you're from Florida and you're interested in this, or even from somewhere else and just want to see it, you could just Google FWC peak rut map, and I'm sure it would come up in one of the top results, but I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But I use that quite a bit when I'm planning which public land areas to hunt.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating map.
Okay. Next is planting native grasses versus just basically eliminating other non-native grasses.
I'm so glad you want to talk about this one.
Yeah. All right. Good. Well, I'll let you explain it.
Okay. So, and I know some people go, "Oh boy, planting native grasses, yawn." Well, but this is important, and I want everybody to listen to this because I think this is one of two studies that came out of the University of Tennessee this year that really have huge implications for things that we as habitat managers and hunters accept as gospel and think that this is the way to do things. Such as, and I'll be honest with you, I'm guilty. I'm guilty of having gone out there and recommended that everybody go buy switchgrass seed and plant that to create early successional habitat. Well, what Wade Gefellers at the University of Tennessee looked at was he set up this great test. He had a couple of different areas where in one area, what he had was non-native tall fescue pasture grass. The kind of place we would tell people, and they've been telling people, kill the fescue, get rid of that non-native invasive pasture grass, and that field will turn into high-quality deer habitat. You can plant it in things like forbs and switchgrass and native warm season grasses and things like that. Go buy the seed and plant it and help turn that into quality deer habitat. So on the two different test areas, what Wade did was he took both of them and killed the fescue with herbicide to get rid of it. In one area, he went out and planted native warm season grass and forb blends based on guidelines like what the USDA NRCS would tell you to do if you were in a CRP program that helps you do this. In other words, there are cost share programs out there to help you restore CRP, early successional habitat, and they'll tell you, go spend this cost share money on these seeds and plant them. So that's what Tennessee did. In the other test area, they killed the tall fescue and just let it come back in native plants from the seed bank. Now, they continued to control non-native things that popped up in there, like the fescue, but otherwise, the stuff that was out there was just there in the seed bank, free. And what they found was, in terms of nutritional and cover benefits for deer, they were the same with both approaches, exactly the same. Yet, the cost per acre of planting the native grasses and forbs was $178. The cost per acre of doing the other approach, where all they did was kill the fescue, was $43. So basically almost $150 spent per acre planting native grasses and forbs that you really didn't need to spend. That was what they found. And that's huge. even in the areas where they planted native grasses and forbs, went out and bought seed and planted it, they found that 95% of the plants deer were feeding on in those fields were native plants that came up from the seed bank. They weren't planted. So even in the areas where they planted stuff, the deer were eating stuff that came up naturally. So it's just a pretty amazing comparison here, and it needs more study. But this is something we've known for a while. You don't have to plant anything. You've got a lot of seeds there in the seed bank. Some are native and good, and some are non-native and bad. But if you just let them grow, put sunlight on the ground, get rid of the non-native pasture grasses like fescue, and let the seed bank take off, you will get native grasses and native forbs and things that deer eat and can hide in naturally. And that's what Wade showed here in a great study, is that, boy, you can really save money. You might want to look at trying the natural approach versus going out and spend money on seeds. But this study, I hope that the USDA NRCS takes a look at this, because, if this is replicated, if other people do this same study and find the same thing and it's repeated again and it's confirmed, I think the NRCS really needs to think about recommending to people to spend cost share dollars buying seed for areas like this where they're trying to improve for deer and wildlife.
Yeah, as it stands, could you still qualify the CRP program if you're not planting native grasses?
That I don't know. I'm not sure, Mike. I think it could. I think you could. Many times these CRP programs are just about ending practices like disking or whatever, and simply getting those to come up in early successional habitat. So I don't think it's necessarily a requirement that you have to go out and plant the seed, but I'm speaking from ignorance there. I could be wrong.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. So where my head goes with that is, so I know we're not talking about food plots. We're talking about early successional planting there. But
that's right.
If you've got, say, 10 acres, then and you can't plant the whole thing in food plots, I just wonder if maybe we as land managers ought to be focusing more on just managing invasives and trying to grow what's already there, rather than spending the same amount of time and money on like half an acre or 1 acre of that of what you could afford to plant a food plot.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that QDMA talks about a lot, and it's extremely effective. You don't even have to have a field of fescue that you need to get rid of the fescue to do this. You can do this in a forest stand where you've got overabundant or invasive trees, like native sweet gums in the South that simply become overabundant sometimes.
Yeah.
Or non-native trees like Callery pears and China berry, and the list goes on, privet and everything else, that you could simply cut down and kill with herbicide, and you have now done the same thing. You've opened a spot of sunlight on the ground, and that will fuel, just like killing fescue in a big open pasture, that will allow the native seed bank to respond. And the things that are there, they will grow. Now, like you said, there's non-native things in that seed bank too. And those are going to come up as well. But if you go through there, say, for example, with a backpack sprayer and just spot spray those as needed and encourage the native stuff, you're doing the same thing. It's an extremely effective approach to produce forage and cover for deer with a chainsaw and a bottle of herbicide that doesn't cost but a few dollars. So,
okay, so this question is going to kind of transition to our next topic. But if you're keeping like an open area, open canopy type area like that, where you've gotten rid of like a bunch of old growth trees and you have, sunlight hitting the floor, is that something you should be maintaining by like bush hogging every year or every other year or something like that to keep things from filling in?
Fire.
Yeah.
Fire. Fire is the trick. That's how you maintain that. And you do it on a rotation. You don't have to do it every year. The best interval for deer habitat is, usually about 3 to 5 years that you want to come back, because what that does, yes, forest is always maturing. And when you open a spot of sunlight, you're going to get vines and shrubs and forbs and little things that deer will love to eat. But quickly, that's going to turn into tree seedlings and tree saplings, and then there's shade on the ground again. And the next thing you know, all the good stuff is gone and it's back to mid-story forest. So you have to stop that process from going on, whether we're talking about an old field or simply forest that you have thinned to put some sunlight among the trees that you've left. And fire is the best way to do that. And again, about 3 to 5 years. It's going to vary in some areas and north to south. In the north, it'll be a little bit longer interval because they have shorter growing seasons. But you don't want to burn too often, because then you don't burn every year, because then you never reach producing some of the better cover stages of plants and better forage. But at the same time, if you wait longer than about 5 years, you start going past the peak of quality and it starts to decline. So fire will set that back.
Okay, so going back to the mower then, I think this was the second thing you talked about that has, might refute some things that has been taught for years.
Yeah. Oh, you're talking about the mowing study?
Yes.
Yes. These were the two, and this was both from the University of Tennessee. Both of these folks that did these studies are some of Craig Harper's graduate students. And for those who don't know, Dr. Craig Harper, Craig, really has made a career out of busting some of the long-held common knowledge about food plots and habitat management that, much of it, frankly, has turned out to be wrong. And, this study about the native warm season grasses and planting those, that's kind of running against conventional wisdom that says you have to go out there and buy seed to plant. No, you don't. It's there. There's native grasses and forbs in the seed bank. Just encourage them and save the money. Well, this other study is about food plots. And this goes to another conventionally held piece of wisdom that with clover and other perennials like alfalfa, that it is good to mow those repeatedly every year. That when you get your nice stand of clover or alfalfa, go out there in the spring and summer and mow it regularly to keep that in productive stages or more nutritional or whatever. Well, Craig's student, Bonner Powell, found that's false. He did a pretty exhaustive study, and we're going to have more on this. He's going to write something for us for QDMA.com and Quality Whitetails in the future, going into more detail on this. But basically, again, they set up a test where they had, stands of ladino clover, stands of red clover, and alfalfa. All these are perennials, and they mowed some of the plots, and they didn't mow some of the plots. And they took tests throughout the spring and summer, throughout the growing season. They looked at deer foraging behavior. They looked at plant quality, all of this. And what they found was mowing doesn't do any good. But what it does do is simply reduce the amount of biomass that's out there for deer to eat. That's all it does. It removes parts of the plants deer could be browsing on. It does not make the plants any more higher in quality nutritionally. So they looked at protein levels, mowed and unmowed, no difference. They looked at nutrient content of the clover and the alfalfa, mowed and unmowed, no difference. They looked at digestibility of those three forages, mowed and unmowed, no difference. They even, Bonner went out there and even took samples of older plant material versus younger plant material. In other words, new leaves that had just formed versus some older, more mature leaves off the plant that had been on there a while. These were, they separated those out and looked at those differently to see if maybe in the mowed plants that it was the fact that those new, younger leaves were higher quality. No difference, y'all. So, again, the only difference they could find was that in the mowed plots, there was simply less clover and less alfalfa for the deer to eat. That's huge. That is completely counter to what a lot of people believe that Craig, this is the funny thing to me, Craig calls it recreational mowing, that we do it because we want to get out of the house. We want to do something, go get on the tractor and do the tractor therapy and go mow some clover. And it sounds great. And, the grass at home in our yard might be knee deep and,
right.
The neighbors might be complaining, but boy, we got to go mow that clover. Can't let that go without being mowed. Recreational mowing is what Craig calls it because there's no benefit. There's no need and no reason to do it. And Bonner's study really captures this well. And I definitely, we want to get some more out on this study out there for QDMA members and deer hunters to see. So save the diesel, y'all. Park that mower. You don't need to do this. Now, they did say in the context of perennial clovers and alfalfa and things like that, the one time when you might want to mow this is late in the summer when these plots usually are kind of thinning out. It's getting hot. It's maybe getting dry. They're not as productive as they were back in spring, and some weeds may be coming in, some broadleaf weeds in particular. And mowing to help knock those weeds back or control them late in the summer is when you'd want to mow these plots. But spring, now, and early summer, when they're lush and green and thick and weeds aren't a problem, don't mow it then. All you're doing is taking food off the plate.
Yeah, but the weed thing was going to be my question, because I thought that was, I had heard that was one of the main reasons to mow them. I've never been able to grow here clover, in the soils that I've, my dad's place and that kind of stuff. It's just so hot and the soil's not great quality. Maybe an annual crop you could get, but perennial just seems like a losing battle to me. But yeah, that's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
The last one dealt with fawns and predation. And it seems like it was like a pretty small sample size, but it's crazy that the study they had 13 fawns and only 3 of them survived for 4 months. Maybe just talk about where that was and why that was.
Yeah, and it is just a little snippet, but one thing I want to say about this is a University of Georgia study, and it is a massive study, and it's going on through next year. And what they are looking at is on the Chattahoochee National Forest. There's a lot of Chattahoochee National Forest, federal land in North Georgia in the Appalachian Mountains. And several chunks of that national forest are managed by the state as WMAs. We're talking about multiple separate WMAs in Georgia that the state manages, even though it's federal land. They manage it as WMAs. And what's going on, the big trend on this national forest land for decades now, over 40 years in Georgia, is a steadily and drastically declining deer harvest. It really has plunged, the deer harvest has, on this public hunting land. And what this massive UGA study is looking at is why? What has happened here? And this is just a small part. There's a number of different graduate students looking at this and looking at various aspects. They've got deer with GPS collars. They're looking at deer movements. They're looking at fawn survival. They're looking at the habitat. They're looking at predators. They're looking at everything. And there's going to be a lot more that will come out of this study. This was just a small snippet. Adam Edge was the University of Georgia student who did a poster presentation on this. At Deer Study Group, by the way, they have both spoken presentations where folks get up and give a 15-minute PowerPoint presentation, but then they have posters. And often they'll put it's a room where students can make a poster of their study and present it that way. And many times, studies that are ongoing or whatever might sort of be in the poster area rather than being given the opportunity to give a spoken presentation. But this was in the poster area. And this year I did note, I think it was because they spent more time on the first day talking about CWD, but I noted that there were a lot of really good talks in the poster presentations that I would have liked to have heard more on. I would have liked to have seen those given as spoken presentations. But anyhow, this was one of the posters. And actually, Adam won an award for the best student poster presentation for this particular poster. But yeah, he was looking at fawn survival. And again, they found that 3 out of 13 fawns that they were tracking survived to 4 months of age in this study on the public land. Most of them were taken by coyotes and black bears. So the bigger picture here is, this is what we know about this public land. And I think this is, me personally, I think it's kind of a no-brainer what they're going to find. What you'll find is timber disturbances, in particular timber harvest, have declined and declined and declined on this national forest for years, to the point that we are now down on all these hundreds of thousands of acres of national forest in North Georgia. We're now down to a point where less than 1%, I think it's something like less than half of 1% of all these acres is in early successional forest, young forest. The rest is in fully mature climax forest with, shaded understory, giant, beautiful trees. I like them, don't get me wrong, but it is the vast majority of this area. And when you don't have any early successional cover and forage for deer, I think that's what they're going to find, is that because timber harvest and timber disturbances on these acres has gone to almost nothing, you just don't have any young forest. You don't have any good cover. You don't have a lot of forage. And so deer populations are plunging, deer harvest is plunging. Meanwhile, they're finding predator numbers are on the climb. There are more black bears in this national forest today than there used to be. Coyotes appear to be more abundant. And so when you've got that going on, when you've got predators numbers climbing, and you've got a steep decline in young forest and early successional cover, it just makes sense that A, predation is going to be higher, productivity of deer is going to be lower because they just have less food and less forage. It is a very acorn dependent economy for deer in that area. It is boom or bust for deer because they are handcuffed to acorns as the primary food source. And in a bad acorn year, deer have a tough year. And in a good acorn year, they have better years. But still, every day of the rest of the year, they need forage, and there's just not much of it out there because it's all mature forest. So anyway, I kind of got up on my soapbox there, but the point that I think this study is going to find, and they are looking at everything. They're looking at habitat, herd factors, predators, all of it, to find out why has hunter harvest on this public land fallen through the floor over the recent decades. And, I think they're going to find a little bit of all that. No timber harvest, no early successional cover, higher numbers of predators. These things are going to be the big factors I think that they'll find that are explaining why hunters find it hard to kill a deer on this public land anymore.
So they only had 23% survive 4 months. What is like a healthy number? What's a standard for that?
Yeah, I'd want to see it expressed in fawns per doe that reached 6 months of age. This was more looking at 4 months, so it really was looking at fawn survival rather than fawn recruitment. Mm-hmm. Fawn recruitment is what you want to look at. It is the numbers of fawns per doe that make it to 6 months of age and basically enter the fall hunting population. You want to see that better than half a fawn per doe. If you can get up around one fawn per doe that makes it to 6 months of age or better, that's good. When you start getting down around half a fawn per doe or less, that's critical. That's too low. Right. So I'm not really sure what their fawn recruitment rate is here. I'd want to see that. But clearly, for only 23% of the fawns they were following to survive is probably not good. That's pretty low. And if you add that to the fact that productivity is probably down and survival of all deer is probably down due to poor habitat quality, that just exacerbates the situation. Yeah, it's only 13 fawns here we're talking about. You're right, that's a pretty small sample size. There's going to be more come out of this study. That sample size will grow. But at the same time, that rate of fawn predation among that group of fawns is nothing shocking when you look at other studies around the Southeast with a lot more fawns have found similar low survival rates, particularly when it comes to looking at how many are killed by predators. So that's no surprise.
I'm hoping that can kind of take hold. I think there's a lot of people in the hunting community that are starting to see that with just these mature forests and public lands where, there's low densities because there's not much habitat. It's just a bunch of tall trees, which are, like you said, they're pretty to look at, but it's a pretty monotonous habitat when it's just rows and rows of that. So
yeah, I mean, you need some of that. I love to hunt in woods like that, and we all want some mature trees out there, but it just can't be everything. It can't be all of it.
And they don't really burn in that area either, do they?
No. It is, many of these areas are wilderness areas where you can't even go in there legally with machines. So people can't do that. Forest personnel can't do that. They're wilderness areas. And so, but even on the non-wilderness areas, the timber harvest has gone down. Any kind of disturbance has gone way down. And, it's kind of the Forest Service has taken the approach for whatever reason, whether it is because of lawsuits from environmental groups that are trying to stop timber harvest, preservationist groups that want to see all this land locked up and never disturbed, which is, in my opinion, the wrong way to go, as we're seeing here, that when you lock up this public land like this and you never allow any kind of disturbance, no timber harvest, no nothing, you end up with one type of forest, mature forest, and that is a low diversity forest, and it only benefits a small number of species. It does not benefit a broad number of wildlife species like a diverse forest does. And certainly for deer, You know, some of that is good. Yes, they eat acorns, but how many months out of the year do they eat acorns? Only a few.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the months of the year, what are they eating? Not dead oak leaves. That's not going to get them through. So they've got to have something else. And when you see this extremely low percentage of young forest in an area like this, there's no doubt in my mind that is what's causing hunter harvest to drop.
It's frustrating. Whatever humans do, it seems like we have to do it to the extreme. You know, like we've either got to like clear cut the whole forest or don't touch any trees at all. And it seems like moderation of everything is going to be what's ideal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. There's a middle ground here, folks. Locking it all up may sound good because you're worried that if we open it up to harvest, then, the government will come in and clear cut it all and special interests will go off with the money. Yeah, that's certainly a fear. I don't want that either. But there's got to be a middle ground. Locking it up and locking out timber management means you are reducing diversity and habitat quality for all wildlife.
And what I find frustrating is actually they're sitting on a resource that could help fund a lot of like wildlife projects.
Yeah.
You know, that those trees are worth money, and they will they'll grow back. So
yeah.
But anyway, we're
Somebody,
not going to solve that.
I talked to someone there at Deer Study Group who told me that when you look at what a normal rotation is for timberlands, it's something, I forget, was something like a 50 to 100 year rotation is ideal. In other words, every 50 to 100 years, a particular acre is going to have a timber harvest on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
These national forest lands are on something right now like a 600-year rotation. It is crazy. I mean, seriously, when you look at the amount of timber activity going on these public forests, the average acre out there will not see a timber harvest for 600 years. I mean, that's insane.
It's so I hunt some in a national forest up in North Florida, and they've actually I've seen a change in the last 5 years where they're actually burning a lot more. They're getting money to go in with equipment and cut through the understory, so it got so bad it was so thick they couldn't even burn. They're not necessarily even just cutting down all the trees, but they're actually controlling the understory and burning more. And I gotta say, I like what it's such a huge difference. Once they get to, like you said, to that 5 year point, in the areas where I'm hunting, it's not that the canopy's closed and nothing will grow. It's that the understory actually is like so thick, nothing can move through it.
Yeah.
They can't get to the food. So,
yep.
Okay. Last thing I want to talk about. This wasn't in the article coming up, but you guys recently, this is an older article, but recently shared it in your email that the coyotes might actually not be killing all these fawns that are the healthy population. A lot of what they're killing might be fawns that weren't going to make it anyway.
Possibly. Yeah, that's a good way to sum it up. It's possible. I wouldn't say that that's been shown.
Okay.
But what we know is this study you're talking about, Justin Dion and several of his officers, his co-workers, co-researchers at the University of Delaware did this study. And they went to an area of Delaware where, amazingly enough, literally there's a big chunk of Delaware where there are no predators. There are no bobcats. A black bear hadn't been seen in decades. And coyotes are almost none. Like literally they went out and did trail camera surveys initially, trying to document any predators in the area and couldn't get any on camera. It's just one of these last pockets of the East that coyotes have not infiltrated. So they went into this area and did some fawn survival studies. It was a great opportunity to look at fawn survival without predators in the area. We know in most areas coyotes are the big one in terms of eating fawns. Black bears eat a lot of fawns too. Bobcats are some. But when you take out all three of those, you've pretty much eliminated all of the major or all of the fawn predators we know of.
You forgot
so they
black
looked
panthers.
At fawn. Well, yeah, I forgot black panthers. I forgot about those. But we're joking. For anyone who believes in a black panther, let me just say that. Please come talk to me if you think you saw a black panther. But so they went and looked at fawn survival and basically found low fawn survival rates. They were finding that many fawns were dying of nutritional stress from being wet by a rainfall at the wrong time, things like that. So they found some survival rates that were equally as low as in some areas where coyotes were eating a lot of fawns. And it kind of raised the question of, maybe coyotes aren't really the problem. Maybe we just, it's tough to get fawns to survive. And that's true. I mean, we know that. Fawns, not every fawn that's born, if something doesn't eat it, is going to live. You got factors like many of the fawns are born to young does who are having fawns for the first time. And because of their lack of experience, because of the fact that they are not a dominant doe in the local area, they don't necessarily find the best fawning cover, the best place to give birth. They aren't necessarily the best mothers. They haven't been through this process yet. So sometimes, and this has been shown, that fawns of older does have higher survival rates than fawns of yearling does. So there's a lot of other factors that go into this. And yeah, not every fawn born is going to live if something doesn't eat it. And that's what these guys found. Now, so it raises some interesting questions. And I'm certainly not saying, and they are not saying that predators are not a factor. They are. We know in many areas that predators are taking a huge number of fawns, and it's not good. So, but I think the big takeaway here is here's one more piece of the puzzle about coyotes. And we keep finding out more and more. There's a great article in the new issue of Quality Whitetails that's coming out. In addition to the one that we've been talking about Southeast Deer Study Group, there's another one. Trying to find the right title here, called Shadow Dogs. Mike Chamberlain and Joey Hinton, both professors at the University of Georgia, wrote this article. And it's about what they're learning about coyotes. And they're really dialing in on some stuff we didn't know about coyotes before, about how huge of an area some of them cover, about how some of them are transients and some of them are residents. In other words, some have a home range and kind of stick to that, and others don't have a home range at all and just roam all over the place. And, so more and more what we're learning is you really cannot assume anything about predators and fawn interactions where you hunt. You have to get out there and find out what's going on, because we know that everywhere there are coyotes does not mean there's a fawn recruitment problem. There's plenty of places, I hunt some of them, where there's pictures of coyotes and we know they're out there, but we've got good fawn survival. It's not a problem. Is it because we have better habitat and cover for the fawns, or nutrition is better, or whatever? I don't know. That's what we haven't totally explained, but we know that all these factors play a role. Predator numbers, population factors, habitat quality, all these things play into that, and you can address them in a number of ways. So if you feel like, the first thing is, if you feel like fawn recruitment is a problem where you hunt, you got to document that. You've got to determine, you got to measure fawn recruitment in a couple of ways. There's some easy ways to do it. We've talked about some of those, and we teach those on the QDMA website. But if you find fawn recruitment is too low and you think deer density is too low for what you ought to be seeing and for what the habitat can support, then you probably should do something about it. That should include multiple things. Trapping predators just prior to the fawn drop is one thing you can do. That's been shown to work to restore fawn survival. It's also been shown not to work in some areas to restore fawn survival. So again, it's kind of a wild card. It might work and you should try it. Another thing you should try is improve the habitat. Try to provide more quality fawning cover. That may help some fawns. There's another article in this issue by Will Goldsby of Auburn University that talks about what they found that shows that it's not necessarily the quality of a spot of cover so much as it is the total amount of edge habitat where you hunt that may help fawns evade coyotes. So, you should work on your habitat. And then finally, like Justin said in their article, if you feel like, fawn survival may be low, but addressing predators doesn't really help it, you may want to look at your doe harvest. Are you maybe taking does when you don't need to, or taking too many does? Or could you shift that toward younger does? In other words, if you got multiple does out there in a food plot and you're about to shoot one of them, have you thought about which one is the mature doe and which one appears to be a younger doe? And if you want more fawns, you might want to take the younger doe for the freezer instead of the mature doe, because she is less likely to produce fawns that survive than the mature doe. So in other words, you might want to shift your doe harvest toward younger deer and protect the older does to help increase your fawn recruitment. So all of these things come into this, and you cannot assume anything about coyotes or fawn survival where you hunt. You've kind of got to get out there and put your finger on the pulse, because we really have not solved the mystery of predators and fawns yet.
All right, I want to give you a chance to bust one more myth real quick, because we just brought it up. It's true that the myth of the old dry doe has been busted, correct?
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's plenty of evidence of fully mature and even post-mature does giving birth to and raising 2 fawns every year. The science on this is clear that really the only doe that tends to have a lower success rate of producing fawns that survive is the youngest does. Does that are yearlings, or whatever it is, age at which they have their first fawns. That is when they tend to have lower survival rates among their fawns. Again, going back to inexperience, the doe itself may not know where the best forage is, where it hunts, or where it lives. It may not be able to find the best fawning cover, etc. But the older the doe, there's no truth to this idea that a really, really old doe is barren and won't ever give birth to fawns. It's pretty amazing how successful some of these older does are at raising fawns.
Okay, so if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you definitely would be interested in the Quality Whitetails magazine. Lindsay, can you tell everybody how people can get their hands on that, get a subscription to that?
Yep, go to QDMA.com, and it's a big button in the upper edge of the website. Join QDMA, and we would appreciate it by doing that. By joining, your dollars are going to a nonprofit organization that is working for the future of whitetails and deer hunters. And we have a 4-star rating from Charity Navigator. You can check this out at the Charity Navigator website. They are an independent group that evaluates nonprofits and charities like us, and essentially sort of is the litmus test, letting you know that the money you're giving to a nonprofit is well spent and spent efficiently. 4-star rating, 2 years in a row, that's the highest rating there is. So your dollars are going to be spent wisely for deer by us. So we'd appreciate that support. And in the meantime, you're going to get a magazine that's got information like what we're talking about that will help you enjoy better deer hunting and where you hunt. So QDMA.com, join today. We'd appreciate it.
And it's not even just the magazine you get. There's always other freebies you get, or sometimes there's a gift card and that kind of stuff. It really is like and those, a lot of things are donated to you. So it's not like the money's coming out of the organization, but there's the cost of being a member is so cheap. And as a member, I can tell everybody, sometimes, you'll donate to somebody, and say you'd like donate $5 or $10, and somehow they get your address, and you feel like they spend, thousands of dollars on mail and phone calls to you over the next 10 years to try to get you to donate more. I don't get that feeling from QDMA at all. It's, you'll maybe get a couple things in the mail about different fundraisers you have, but it's not like it's a hassle to be part of the organization, because they're always bugging you for more money. So I really appreciate that.
And that's actually one of the things that Charity Navigator looks at. They look at the percentage of your budget that goes towards your mission work versus fundraising. And 90% of our budget goes to mission and program work, the things we say we're going to do for deer hunters, and very little of it goes to fundraising. So thank you for pointing that out. I'm glad you noticed.
Yeah. All right, Lindsay, anything else we need to keep on top of with what's going on with QDMA?
Not in terms of the deer science. Just join. You'll get the magazine. We'll keep you updated on this stuff. Some of these folks will actually be writing lengthier articles for us about their research. But meanwhile, QDMA's work goes on. We got a lot of things going on. We're gearing up for another big year of Field to Fork, which, as you know, is our adult hunter recruitment program that really is going great. Getting excited about that. We're working on habitat improvement here at QDMA headquarters, because we're using this land for many of these hunters here in Georgia to hunt. But we've got that program going on in other states. So, that's the next big thing coming up for us is hunting season and hunter recruitment. Always something going on here.
And it really just helps the organization just even to have more members. Of course your $35 donation helps, but just being a stronger organization I mean, if you're a deer hunter, it's like your slogan says, it's where deer hunters belong. You guys really should be a part of it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what we want to be. I mean, we're all deer hunters here. And at the end of the day, I think any deer hunter, that's what I want. I want any deer hunter to be able to look at what we do and say, I can get behind that. And I think they can.
And while we're talking about it, everybody should be part of the National Deer Alliance as well, which is, not directly associated with you guys, but that's free to be a part of. Those are two organizations. If you're into whitetail hunting, very, very low amount of every year, you can support a lot of the causes that we need to be supporting.
Yeah, QDMA co-founded the National Deer Alliance along with the Mule Deer Foundation and Whitetails Unlimited. Many other groups have come on board since to help support it as more of a bigger umbrella group for all deer, mule deer, whitetails, everything in North America to look at some of the challenges, particularly like chronic wasting disease.
And I guess the last thing I'll say is if you're really, really into this stuff, you ought to come to the QDMA convention because a lot of the people from the Southeast Deer Study Group do talks there, and it's a lot of the same people. And I imagine it's a similar atmosphere, but a lot less sciencey. So similar type personalities and thoughts, just maybe not so much molecule and that kind of stuff. But,
yeah, and the other thing too is to look into our Deer Steward courses. You can take Deer Steward Level 1 online now at home, and the presentations and speakers in that, bring in a lot of the science from Deer Study Group, but put it in terms that us deer hunters can use and understand. And then, when you get into Level 2, which is more of the hands-on Deer Steward courses, you're going and spending a weekend with people like Dr. Craig Harper, who did some of this research I just talked about, and learning directly from him and people like him, some of these myths about habitat management and deer behavior. So Deer Steward would be a great way to go deeper.
Thank you so much for coming on with us, and I'm going to look forward to doing this next year, and hopefully I'll see you at some of these events throughout this year.
I'm sad it's over, Mike. I can't believe Year 3 is done. I'm already looking forward to next year too. So Thank you so much for doing this with me and sharing this with your listeners. I really appreciate it, and we appreciate your support of QDMA.
All right, we'll talk soon.
Take care.
We're out down south.